This decade has been one of incredible strides and equal lows in the gaming industry. With the 7th generation of gaming consoles coming to a close in 2013, the rest of the decade was marked by improving graphics, the SAG-AFTRA strikes, and a seemingly endless stream of controversies that range from crowbarring microtransactions into every game imaginable, to entire chunks of games being cut before launch and sold mere months later as DLC, to political turmoil and a sense of pride and accomplishment, and
Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
it's been an equal parts fascinating and frustrating decade, and it's been filled to bursting with some of the best gaming experiences we've ever seen. Of all the incredible games that were released over the last 10 years, there is one in particular that I want to put forward as the most important game of the decade, a game whose legacy is still felt today, whose release sent some fairly large waves rippling through the industry, and from whom lessons can still be learned moving forward into the next decade of gaming. So, let's talk about The Binding of Isaac. The original Binding of Isaac was a charming little flash game created by Edmund Macmillan, creator of Super Meat Boy, that was initially released on Steam with a demo made available on Newgrounds back in 2011. And when I say charming, I mean thoroughly disgusting in every conceivable way, and I love it. Ostensibly a roguelike and largely credited with renewing interest in the genre over the past 8 years, The Binding of Isaac is an extremely simple game. You control Isaac, a little boy whose mother is told by God to kill him, as he escapes into the basement of his house, where he must fight through rooms of increasingly horrifying enemies, bosses, and eventually defeating fallen angels, Satan, and even Isaac himself. Inspired by the biblical story of the same name, the game features items unlocked through specific actions, like using the Bible to kill Mum and unlock the Halo, characters from the stories with their own unique playstyles, and it encourages repeat playthroughs in an effort to unlock everything and earn the Golden God achievement. The game was a surprise success, and in 2014, Macmillan worked with developer Nicalis to create a brand new, fully recreated version of the game called Rebirth, featuring brand new art, items, bosses, enemies, and a whole lot more. Rebirth was a huge success and would go on to spawn additional chapters in the game's lifecycle, including Afterbirth, Afterbirth Plus, and the upcoming Repentance, as well as booster packs that introduce new items and new characters for free. Although aspects of the DLC were criticised for being rehashed content with inconsistent enemy AI and some fascinating telefragging issues with the game's current final boss, Delirium, subsequent patches have largely ironed out these issues. So what makes Binding of Isaac the most important game of the decade? Well, actually before we get into that, let's talk about another game first. Let's talk about Dark Souls. Let's be honest, there's not much I can say about this game that hasn't already been said. For better or for worse, Dark Souls has inarguably been one of the most influential games of the decade, to such an extent that its very name has become a meme. Its world building is almost second to none, its story and lore deep, rich, and the foundation for a number of now extremely successful YouTube channels. It can be played as if difficulty is the be-all and end-all, and must be overcome with better gear and stronger weapons, or it can be played butt naked with a club and no levelling. The sheer number of challenge runs for this game and its successes is practically unquantifiable, from no-hit to bow-only to class challenges, mage to knight to deprived, from dying to pinwheel to defeating Ornstein and Smough at level 1 without pyromancy. There's so much replayability to Dark Souls that it's honestly astounding. But it wasn't this aspect of the game that cemented it as a game of the decade, it was the difficulty. And yes, whilst it's a meme at this point, Dark Souls' difficulty was a source of contention as much as it was lauded. It's not the first game to incorporate risk versus reward, to incentivise learning enemy patterns, to bang your head against a brick wall until something just clicks. And every successive run is a breeze in comparison. I had that moment fighting Ornstein and Smough for the first time. I was so determined to kill them with heavy armour and a Zweihander because I was so scared of taking damage and bloody awful at dodging attacks, until at last I snapped, discarded the heavy armour, went in almost stark bollock naked with a halberd, and beat them on that attempt. And there are very few games that have captured that feeling of extreme reward and the rush of adrenaline that comes with defeating a boss that seemed impossible the first time you saw them. And though its formula has been replicated 1,000 times over by now, it remains a pioneer of a generation of games obsessed with being the next Souls-like. But before we talk about why Dark Souls is so important, let's just take a minute to talk about something else as well. Let's talk about Undertale. It's very difficult to put into words just how huge the impact of this charming little indie game was. Undertale was enormous. It still is to an extent. What began as this unassuming, delightful and at times extremely depressing little sprite-based semi-bullet hell indie game turned into a sprawling collection of dedicated fans, with something of a knee-jerk reaction to even the faintest criticism. Multiple console ports, a Japanese localization and some very interesting fan art. Almost entirely the work of one man, Toby Fox, Undertale was the recipient of numerous Game of the Year awards, with particular emphasis on its engrossing and well-written story, fascinating characters, genuine consequence-based gameplay, metatextual elements, music, and the ability to play the game entirely in pacifist mode. Although it paid homage to several older beloved retro games, Undertale also forged its own path, catapulted its creator to fame, and proved that though the indie scene had its faults, it didn't take much to revitalise it. Just a little care, love and devotion. And erotic sans fan art. But as good as Undertale is, I'm not sure I'd call it the most important game of the decade. The argument could definitely be made, but well, let's just take a moment to talk about a different indie game, or rather an indie game franchise. Five Nights at Freddy's. Wait. Let me finish before you type an angry comment or throw popcorn at the screen. I never said the most important game of the 2010s had to be a good game. Look, I don't hate the FNAF games. I've honestly actually never played them, and I have no real intention of doing so. And although by now the majority of the games that have been released since the original have been the same cookie-cutter gameplay in a slightly different setting, or at least that's the impression I get from the videos that I've seen, there's no denying that the original was a huge success, and its impact on the industry, no matter how good or bad that may be, is observable even today. Five Nights at Freddy's was born from its creator's distress over his first Christian-inspired game being lambasted as terrifying instead of cute like he was aiming for, and it took just 6 months to create. The decision to have the animatronics rarely move on screen but rather appear in one place or another when the camera wasn't focused on them was a deliberate design choice, as Scott Cawthon felt that this was far more terrifying. And though the game was simple, repetitive, and certainly not something that could be endlessly replayed once the core game reached the end of Night 7, it birthed a rabid fanbase devoted to unravelling the game's lore, its universe, and its hidden meanings. If Amnesia: The Dark Descent was the birthplace of YouTube's Let's Plays, then FNAF absolutely solidified it. Videos by PewDiePie, Markiplier, Jacksepticeye, and numerous other now huge channels saw their videos draw in millions upon millions of views. The trend towards using jump scares as a central game mechanic certainly didn't start with FNAF, but there's no denying that the series popularised it beyond all sense and reason. As the game's audience and appeal grew, so too did the number of cheaply made, poorly animated or straight up ripped off games. Though these days the fervour around the series has died considerably, it's still a series with a good deal of pull, and to this day new entries that have deviated further and further from the original formula continue to be made. I have a lot of respect for Scott Cawthon. He took the criticism and backlash he faced with Chipper and Lumber Company and turned it into something genuinely industry-changing. But let's talk about just one more game before we really wrap up this little experiment. And I'm fairly sure that you can guess what it is given the criteria that I've set for the last few entries, but let's be honest, it was going to come up sooner or later. Minecraft is a game about building things. It's so simple, it's criminal. The world is made of blocks, you are made of blocks, everything is made of breakable blocks, and it's your job to either survive, build, or build and survive, depending on your preference. Minecraft is such an unassuming game with its low graphical fidelity straight out of the 90s, its adorable bleep bloop music, charming critters and explosive barrels. There's nothing more satisfying than spawning hundreds of barrels of TNT and watching the server shit itself as it tries to calculate and render the destruction. Although it isn't a game that I go back to much these days, there was a time way back when my sister and I would play Minecraft every day after school. We covered an entire map in one huge fort, built tree houses, captured animals to keep as pets. We built an entire underground complex in the sandstone, made our own mini forts. Each session was probably the longest we'd ever been without arguing or beating each other up. And the sheer number of things that we could create even back then, almost a decade ago now, was remarkable. And these days it's even more impressive. Fully functioning graphics calculators, Game Boys, enormous portraits of Sarah Kerrigan, an Irishman imprisoning 200 people and forcing them to build Starbucks World. There really are the proverbial endless possibilities. Minecraft is considered the most successful video game ever. Its ability to appeal to everyone, adult and child alike, and to bring together people from all around the world is indisputable, and it deserves to be lauded as the achievement that it is. And whilst I'm sure that Notch's rolling in cash, sleeping on a bed of money, bathing in champagne and all that, it's well earned and well deserved no matter what you might think of the man himself. If I could, I would love to go back to those days when my sister and I would just sit and play Minecraft for hours, because as much as we argued and bitched and shouted at each other, that was the one thing that we could just chill and enjoy, blow things up, build castles and just have fun. But anyway, now that we've outlined a few of the most important games of the decade, it's time for this to turn 100% subjective. Each has its pros and cons, and they're all hugely important in their own way, and their effect on the industry is tangible. So, which of these games am I suggesting is the most important game of the last 10 years? Actually, none of them. They're all equally as important in their own way, whether I like them or not, but honestly, there is one more game that we need to talk about. The most important game of the 2010s, in my opinion, is something that you might not expect, and the sad reality is that it's important for all of the wrong reasons. No Man's Sky was officially unveiled at VGX 2013. Reaction to the game saw enormous hype with its proposed scope, aesthetic, and its commitment to an enormous procedurally generated universe going over extremely well. It was going to be the greatest space sim of all time. Time magazine's Matt Peckham speculated that the game would be the next big industry changer, although some cautioned that the hype should be scaled back after the earlier, colossal disappointment of 2008's Spore. The day before release, Sean Murray, the game's creative director, tweeted that players should not expect the game that their trailers had promised. Murray had earlier discussed the unrealistic level of excitement surrounding the game and said that he and Hello Games had been reasonably open and honest about what the game was. And No Man's Sky's release was a shit show. Critical reviews were largely mixed, but the fanbase that had been building up to the greatest space sim of all time were far less charitable. The game received overwhelmingly negative reviews on Steam, Metacritic and other platforms for a multitude of issues, ranging from inability to launch the game, graphical bugs, and a variety of glitches and performance issues. Poor implementation of its procedural world, the lack of multiplayer, and the litany of missing features that had either been promised in interviews or shown off in trailers. False truths surrounding the game's implementation of multiplayer were quickly uncovered, and gamers began to compile an enormous Reddit thread consisting of every single negative aspect of the game, whether it had been touted as a feature or not. The game's release was easily one of the most memorable in gaming history for the time. In the immediate aftermath of No Man's Sky's release, both Hello Games and Sean Murray went dark. From the point at which the game was released to the Foundation update in November 2016, there was almost zero contact from the studio. In later interviews, Murray would discuss the numerous death and bomb threats that he and his team had received, to such an extent that Scotland Yard were heavily involved in investigations. The company's Twitter account was compromised and used to tweet that NMS was a mistake. The official subreddit was temporarily deleted by a moderator after the overwhelming level of toxicity became too much to handle. And in September 2016, the UK's Advertising Standards Agency became involved after receiving complaints that the advertising was in breach of regulations, although they would later state that there was no breach of advertising standards and that Valve also could not be held responsible for Hello Games material. In the years that followed, No Man's Sky became a cautionary tale of how easy it is for one small slip of the tongue to snowball into a campaign of half-truths, lies, and disaster. But hang on a minute though, if No Man's Sky was so bad and everyone hated it, why am I saying it's the most important game of the decade? And it's not because of what No Man's Sky is or what it was when it was released. The game that we have now is almost unrecognisable from what was originally released. No, it's what No Man's Sky isn't, or at least wasn't, that gives me cause to consider it so important. And it's not because the game wasn't what it was supposed to be when it was released, not really. It's that there was an up-and-coming company filled with extraordinary promises, desperate to prove themselves in a stagnant industry that was filled with EAs and Activisions and Bethesdas. And this little company said, we've got this great game, and we think you're gonna love it. It's filled with life, it's got all these features, it's going to be incredible. The thing is that we were used to hearing those lies from AAA companies. We were used to seeing incredible gameplay trailers and watered down final products. We'd gotten so used to having microtransactions crammed into every fucking facet of every fucking game that we played, that most of us just started to gloss over them, glassy-eyed and blank-faced. We were so used to being dicked over by the AAA industry that the moment a small, basically indie team said, look at what we're making, we clambered aboard the hype train without a second thought. And this, to me, is what makes No Man's Sky the most important game of the 2010s. Disregarding what it is now, when this game launched it was one huge, horrifying slap in the face, a painful reminder that no one was immune to the corporate grind and greed, and that the onslaught of broken promises that we'd so often associated with the industry primarchs could infect even the smallest of studios. But there is also something else that I think makes this game so important. Not the immediate backlash and the lessons learned from it, nor even the brief distraction from an otherwise average year of gaming. Not even the slow decline of one of the last truly loved AAA companies. It's the fact that though it took some time, the developers have spent the last 4 years making up for every single costly mistake that they made. Free update after free update, VR support, multiplayer, base building, basic quality of life improvements, taking on board every scrap of feedback from the small, dedicated player base that they had, and slowly rebuilding the fractured support they'd lost at launch. No one seems to really talk about No Man's Sky anymore, but maybe that's for the best. Maybe 4 years is a long enough time to forgive its original sins because, let's be honest, many people playing the game for the first time won't and will never know just how bare bones the game was when it first launched. And let's be honest, this game was a mess. In some respects, it's still a mess, and in a way it always will be. The stigma of dishonesty will always follow it in some form or another. But consider the slow climb of its Steam ratings, the increasing goodwill of the public, the willingness of many to come back with each fresh free update. Where many other companies have launched broken products only to backtrack and claim we never said that, or simply abandon their product completely, Hello Games have come back time and time again to add more and more to their sunken ship. And judging by audience reaction, it hasn't been entirely for nothing. The legacy of No Man's Sky will always be one of ifs and buts. What if the game hadn't launched empty and barren? What if the game had everything it promised but was broken? What if the team had never bothered trying to fix anything? What if this impossible game had just stayed impossible? There was a time when I dismissed the strides that the team had made to improve No Man's Sky as the desperate struggles of a company trying too hard to save what little face they had left. I thought it shallow and pointless and thought, why bother? The game was dead from the word go, right? Nothing they could do would ever make up for the lies that had been peddled and the mess that No Man's Sky had left in its wake. But then the industry began to fester further. Lies stacked upon lies, promises were broken again, and companies that we already knew to be shady began to scramble to recover their dignity with every bad press event, every stupid decision, every insidious practice. When No Man's Sky Next was released, adding an enormous, fully fleshed out story to a game that had at one time ended with a kick to the teeth, it was a sure sign that Hello Games were well on their way to redemption. So maybe No Man's Sky isn't a great game, hell, maybe it isn't even a good game, but the game that exists today is one of a sadly small number of products that its developers have bothered to take accountability for. Sean Murray is by no means Randy Pitchford or Tim Sweeney or Todd 16 times the detail Howard. He's a man who was always uncomfortable in front of a camera, who came across as likeably awkward in that he's not funny but let's just laugh to make him feel better kind of way. And the game his company fostered is absolutely no Binding of Isaac or Dark Souls or Undertale. Its crafting system is nowhere near as fascinating or robust as Minecraft, and the degree to which it impacted the industry isn't even in the same stratosphere as Five Nights at Freddy's. But after releases like Battlefront 2, Fallout 76, the original Final Fantasy XIV, endless Sonic the Hedgehog cash grabs, and after a long and at times stagnant decade, it's refreshing to see developers at least trying to make an effort with their failures. And let's be honest, at least it isn't Aliens Colonial Marines, or Duke Nukem Forever, or The War Z, or Black Ops Declassified, or Ride to Hell Retribution, or Alone in the Dark Illumination, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, Umbrella Corps.